Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to FortneyScott's COVID-19 weekly briefing. These briefings are held every Monday and cover the latest topics and developments impacting the workplace with regard to COVID-19. This briefing will be recorded. Everyone who registered today will be registered for all future briefings. The weekly briefings will continue as long as circumstances develop with regard to COVID-19. I would like to address some preliminary items before we start today's briefing. Currently, all listeners' phones are muted. At any point in time during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question in the GoToWebinar question box. We will try to answer all questions. Today's weekly briefing addresses the legal challenges employers are facing. The presenters include FortneyScott's attorneys, David Fortney, Nita Beecher, and Bert Fishman. I will now turn the program over to David Fortney to start our weekly briefing.
Terrific. Thank you very much, and good day, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Today's June 1st, and we are excited to start a new month, but with many of the same challenges we've been dealing with. So joining me today, I'm really delighted to have both Nita Beecher and Bert Fishman as indicated. Let me take care of a few preliminaries. Let's jump to the next slide for a moment quickly. Just a word about who we are. As most of you know, we are Washington, D.C. based, although obviously we are all working from our respective home offices. And our practice focuses on the federal agencies, and we focus on the workplace. All of our attorneys, including those on today's panel, have extensive experience in addressing workplace matters, particularly with respect to the federal agencies governing compliance and the developments on the federal sector. With respect to the materials today, as indicated in the next slide, we are going to be providing legal information, but today's purpose is just that, to provide you with updates on the most recent developments. We are not providing specific legal advice for your company. We would encourage you to confer with your in-house counsel or, as appropriate, with experienced outside employment counsel. We do have the privilege of working with many on this call, and we do deeply appreciate that and look forward to continuing that relationship. All right. Well, Nita, let me ask you if you can jump right into the agenda, and we'll talk a little bit about what we want to cover today.
That sounds great. Thank you, David. And fortunately, we had our monthly alarm just went off and ended just as you turned it over to me, because that makes a lot of noise there. Anyway, we're going to do our usual recent developments and updates. There's a bunch of stuff going on in Washington that we're going to provide you some input, but the focus of today really is going to be best practices for reopening your office. And we kind of have broken it down into what, who, when, and how the workers will return, policies and key operational concerns, and then we will address various, in a little more in-depth, we're going to talk about issues on reopening, employee issues, and so forth, and finally conclude with takeaways. And with that, I think, Valerie, we're ready for the next slide. David, I think you're up.
Sure, thanks. So we're going to start with, as we usually do, we like to take a few minutes before we start and talk a little bit about what happened within the last week. It continues to be very significant developments on many fronts, so we like to recapture those at the outset. And Bert, why don't you start with the CDC guidance, which continues?
Yeah, as some of you know, the CDC has published a series of different guidances. The most recent, and for me the most important, was published in the middle of last week. You can see at the bottom of the slide how you can get it for yourself. This one is different in that it has some significant guidance for opening offices, and we'll talk about them in greater detail later in the presentation. But the main thing to remember is there is a strong preference throughout this for working remotely, but if you open the office, this will give you a kind of detailed guide to the nuts and bolts of things you have to do from a health perspective. So don't look to the guidelines for practical advice on running your office. It's how to clean, how to keep people socially distanced, how to keep your place a healthy environment. Some of the advice that we'll talk about is not very practical, but you have to remember it's coming from the CDC's point of view. Perhaps for some of you, the most important single aspect of it to remember is, like its predecessors, this is a guidance. It is not the traditional CDC mandate for what you must do to comply with the CDC's guidances. These are very, very powerful suggestions, but only that. And let's move on to the next slide, and we'll talk in more detail later.
Okay. So one of the areas where there continues to be a lot of attention is the question of whether there should be a so-called safe harbor. That, and as we've indicated, whether it's a safe harbor or an escape hatch, kind of frames the two issues. In Washington, there's both a political and a policy debate going on as to whether employers are going to face unexpected and in some's view, inappropriate risks and liability simply from reopening. That if workers come in and become ill, or if customers return to a business and become ill with COVID, that there could be debilitating or even business-ending litigation costs that come forward. The question of whether that promotes, that is creating, that whether there should be what we call a safe harbor, which means that there would be a defense or protection or restriction in some manner in filing claims against a business. Whether that is a positive or a negative from a public policy standpoint, does it promote businesses reopening, or does it allow them to be reckless, as the critics would say, an escape hatch, and not follow best practices? There's very many debates in terms of both from the legal perspective as to how far the federal government can go in instituting these changes versus what the state's rights are, the traditional regulator of health and safety matters, in terms of the role of workers' compensation, which historically has been a bar or a defense for any work-related claims, and whether the levels of enforcement and how they would occur. Interestingly, we've mentioned this before at a hearing before the Senate, Senator Graham and Senator Klobuchar, who are at very different ends of the political spectrum, both agreed that it would be potentially beneficial to have more specific requirements. To Bert's point at the outset, CDC and OSHA has issued guidances, but they're not with the force of law. They're not a regulatory requirement. And one of the thoughts that Senator Graham had, who's a proponent of safe harbor, is that it would be helpful to have standards that people need to satisfy, and if they do, they should have a safe harbor. So we'll see where that goes. Let me just pause there.
If I could just add, David, on the expanding role of the states, the governor of California announced last week that he was creating a virtually irrebuttable presumption that any COVID illness in the workplace would be treated as a workers' compensation injury, which is a vast expansion and takes a lot of the heat out of this argument for our largest state.
Right, and so that takes into account claims by workers and means that unless there was gross negligence or reckless conduct by an employer, the workers' remedies, if they become ill, would really be to look to the workers' comp system, and that is something that, again, employers can buy insurance for. There's a level of risk mitigation that can go with that. Anita, you had noted some of the other states, I think, so the trend of the states not waiting for the feds to sort this out is already beginning.
Correct.
You had some activity in, was it Louisiana?
Louisiana has got a bill moving through there. I don't think it's to the governor's desk yet, but they're definitely stepping out to protect employers. They were a fairly early state, and they had a huge outbreak in New Orleans. So at least New Orleans, I would expect all of the southern states to look to that. And Missouri, I think, has one already in the hopper as well. So if the feds don't act fairly quickly, we're going to have the same kind of patchwork on this that we've had on the open and closing orders.
Right. Okay. So those trends are just beginning to unfold, and whether there ultimately is a national coalition or not, we're still probably a couple weeks away from having the answer to that. All right, let's talk about the next development. Next slide, please. With respect to Congress being at an impasse, right before Memorial Day, the House passed what's called the HEROES Act. Speaker Pelosi has been very clear that that is the, if you will, what she calls the opening bid. It's designed to be the beginning of a discussion with the Senate led by Leader McConnell over what the next round is. I think there's a growing consensus that there needs to be further funding, further relief monies made available, but how many so-called strings or other components are included or not included, those details are hotly debated. One other development that although the Senate has primarily been focusing on judicial votes votes on judicial nominees, there is an important vote coming up for the federal agencies that govern the workplace, both nominees for several agencies, but in particular, the EEOC and the National Labor Relations Board are scheduled to be voted out of committee, and that will be on June 3rd. Following that vote, it is anticipated that those nominees will likely quickly be confirmed by the U.S. Senate and be in their positions. So we may have actually full complements of positions being filled both at the EEOC, the National Labor Relations Board, and some of the other agencies that are part of this packaged approach. So it's been a long time coming, that vote, and we're appreciative of that. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit, unless anyone has anything further on that slide. I'd like to talk a little bit, because it was a very busy week for OSHA, too. And OSHA continues to have a lot of pressure. I'll kick off on this. The House subcommittee last week had a much anticipated hearing where the head of OSHA was brought forward. And as you might anticipate, there was a fair amount of criticism that OSHA faced. At the hearing, it was again brought forward that OSHA had refused and has not issued a temporary standard or a temporary regulation. So there is no specific COVID regulation on the books. They're relying on the general duty obligation under the OSHA Act. There was frustration expressed by members of the subcommittee that OSHA had received very many complaints and made, I think they've issued so far one citation to a nursing home in Georgia, but that there were over 4,000, approaching 4,500 at this point. I think this slide's even gotten out of date in the last 48 hours, but about 4,500 complaints and a number of whistleblower complaints that OSHA, and the criticisms was, you got to be kidding me. You mean you can't find out of those complaints anything more than one citation, so forth. So there was a lot of frustration there. OSHA's response was that COVID and the very many variations of it, general duty is the best tool to use, that a regulation is not the best approach, and that OSHA is in fact on the job, and that investigations and citations take a while, and to be patient. OSHA also has been sued by the FL-CIO, again trying to compel the agency to issue a regulation. Those of you in the construction industry, and we have some on this call, note last week OSHA issued specific guidance for construction, and so that is something that is terribly important also there. All right. Anything else on OSHA? OSHA continues to be the agency that really is taking the lead here, and under a lot of pressure whether general duty will be sufficient. Nita.
I was just going to say they do have a lot of guidance on the OSHA website as far as what people should be doing. And I think that is definitely, and we've got the link there, it's definitely a place people should go as they're getting ready, and we'll talk about in just a minute, getting ready to open their offices.
Correct. I would also like to add the construction has been considered an essential industry from the beginning. So those businesses have been operating throughout the COVID outbreak, and these guidelines are a little late, but very important.
Correct. Okay. So, well, let's turn right into now and start reviewing kind of the beginning of the best practices for an office opening, and review that list, and then we will spend a little bit of time really getting into both planning and some of the issues. So, Bert, why don't you kick us off on this discussion, please? Can't hear you,
Actually,
Bert.
I think Bert is.
I'm sorry. The first thing that you have to think about, there we are. The first thing that you have to think about is the breadth of the kinds of decision that you'll be making. That's why we talk about reimagining the workplace. You have to think about the new context that you'll be working in terms of what kind of work can be done, what kind of work will be done, what kind of work should be done in the office, and you'll be thinking about things that are distant from your experience. All of you are great business planners, but not many of you have thought about how to redesign and reconfigure your office, how to move people in and out carefully, how to stagger workforces, how to stagger shifts, how to reimagine your workforce in terms of tactical units to bring some in on Monday and some in on Thursday. So the first thing that I would ask you to think about is, it's like many of you did when the ADA was passed, when you had to look at every job description and rethink what that job meant. Well, you're going to be doing that now for your entire workplace. And once you've got those kinds of things worked out in your plan, you have to think about how you're going to actually bring people into the office. You have to develop, and this is very much recommended by the CDC, to develop a preparedness and response plan for all the kinds of contingencies that you can imagine, and the CDC guidance will help you imagine some of them. And it's very critically important that once you have gone through this difficult process, this really kind of mind-taxing process, that you communicate your plans to everybody. Make sure everybody understands their responsibilities, their obligations, the concerns you have, the concerns they have. You want to make sure that everybody knows that you are bearing their health and safety in mind, so that yours is the kind of workplace, when you reopen, that your workers want to come back to and feel that their concerns have been treated with some concern. And we'll talk about specific elements of those concerns as the presentation continues. But this is really the kind of formative guidance that you have to make, and it's a significant task, and I urge you all, don't do this alone. Bring in teams of people who have expertise that can assist you in all of these various criteria. And we'll get more specific as we move through the presentation. So we can go to the next slide and let's folks contribute.
Well, I think the thing that's interesting about what you were just saying, Bert, that we really want to focus on is that you have an opportunity to reimagine what your office is going to look like and what work really needs to be done. As St. Louis has opened more quickly than DC, so I've started to talk to people about how they've done that. And it's incredible how the workplaces, the offices are reopening with staggered shifts and so forth and so on. And that's really, I think, you kind of got to step out of your comfort zone and think about what really works. And again, I think, Bert, you pointed it out, you want to, for those who can stay and work from home, that's what's recommended.
Well, if I could just briefly talk about the CDC recommendations, as I promised earlier, this is a fascinating plan because the focus is very, very much on the health and safety of your building. And it's going to ask you to make some changes that may not be practical. For example, in downtown DC, the CDC recommends that everybody drives alone to avoid mass transit. Well, that's not humanly possible. There's not enough parking places in all of DC for even half the buildings on K Street. But they ask you to think about the cleaning of the building, the cleaning of your ventilation system. They ask you to think about, closing the fridge, getting rid of individual of any community amenity. Use that big conference room for meetings of 4. And then they get down to the nitty-gritty of how your workers are going to work together. How are they going to get there? What kind of engineering, administrative controls are you going to impose on your workforce? The main point that they make throughout their recommendations is this all depends on employer leadership and employee compliance. But the main thing you have to do is to educate your workers on how to protect themselves at the workplace. And for some of you, some of the social distancing techniques that they recommend are simply impractical. I mean, 2 people in an elevator in a 50-story building means you're going to take the whole workday just to get your workforce into the office. So you have to remember the point of view that the CDC is taking. From my point of view, the subtext of the CDC guidance is, if you can work remotely, because the kinds of protections that the CDC is recommending are intrusive, they're difficult to meet, they're probably very important for protecting the workforce, but they may not fit all situations. And as I say, in the earlier slide, there's the link so you can see this for yourself. Yes, David?
Let's take a moment, though, because I want to make sure that people really focus on this, because I think that a lot of time and energy has been focused on whether people have to wear masks, facial coverings. Notice that is literally the last line of defense, the hierarchy of controls. And this is what, as an organization, we talk about a team. You know, can you eliminate the hazard? Can you replace the hazardous situation? Can you isolate the people from the hazard? Engineering controls. Can you change the way people work? We've talked about this in detail in prior sessions about reconfiguring the office, the conference rooms, that sort of thing. The point being that the absolute last barrier, after you have all the other changes that are feasible and possible done, is protecting the individual with a face covering or other shields like that. And that's why working at home, that's an administrative control. You know, an engineering control is, again, how you reconfigure the office. So this is beyond strictly a human resource people. Most of the EEO and workplace issues are on the bottom 2 prongs, about the administrative controls and about the personal protective. But a sound plan by an organization has taken the entire hierarchy and gone through each one of these. And we've talked about that in prior sessions before, but it's very important. And this, by the way, also fits very nicely with the OSHA standards under the general duty and the guidance that OSHA has issued. So these, although guidelines, they are beyond a best practice. They're something that, in terms of whether compliance with the general duty, we're advising clients you want to be able to demonstrate how you have complied with the hierarchy of controls and consider each and every one of those. Okay.
And David, in offices where it's not your building, you still have, as an employer, the obligation to make sure that that office, you know, the building owner is cleaning properly and that type of thing, that they are creating how the elevators go up in a way that's protected, so people don't have to touch the buttons to go up to the office, and how they're going to stand and that type of thing.
And due diligence includes asking the building about the HVAC system, about the cleaning protocol.
Absolutely.
There's a whole range of things. It isn't just physically what's in your office if you're in that type of setting.
That's what I talked about earlier, and let me repeat again about this being a group effort that includes not just your own staff, but the building staff, the maintenance staff, the physical facilities people. It is from A to Z, and it is as I said at the beginning, the breadth of issues with which you have to deal is probably greater than you're thinking right now, and you have to deal with it on a very, very broad spectrum.
I would say the other thing is most people are into these issues at this point. If you're not, candidly, you're a little behind the curve, but you need to, before you seriously reopen an office, have walked yourself through these issues for your particular office operation to think about how it's going to play. All right. Well, let's move on. Talk a little bit more, please, about next slide. Yeah. Let's get into a little more of the detail about the what, who, when, and how workers return. So let's start with the what. What work will be done? And this starts again from, as Bert said and Nita both made the point, the presumption, the preferred option is maximize who is working remotely, who can work at home. But assuming we are not in that mode, that we are reopening, Let's start with what work actually needs to be done in the office. That will determine who's required in terms of staffing, what work's being performed, how it's being performed, whether the workers that are now going to be in an office, how they are interacting with the remote workforce, because up to this point, everyone's been remote, what you're doing with things like supply chains, backlog. Again, there's no need to go through all the effort of having people show up and then not have them able to work and work effectively and efficiently. Most organizations have found a way office work is being done today. So the question is, if we're taking some back in the office, how's that going to change, and how will it continue to change? I think most organizations recognize that the initial return to the office is just that. It's the beginning, and that there will continue to be a phase-in of work and people, including the timing, the staffing. Some people may not want everyone to come at 8, from 8 till 5. Maybe you have people working multiple shifts, multiple time zones. Recommendation under most guidelines is you start with perhaps 25% of your staff, which raises a lot of questions about what work is being done and who's necessary to do it. Okay.
Well, that's part of, David, just to pick up on your comment about the administrative controls, thinking about tactical teams of who's going to come in. Maybe you'll split your workforce into various teams so that you can make 25% on any given day. So start thinking creatively about the workflow and how you make things work. When you bring people into the office, make sure they're the people whose presence in the office creates the synergy you need to make all of them useful. As I say, it's something that will take a lot of forethought. Everybody's up to it. It's just something they haven't thought of before.
Right. Hi, Anita.
Yeah, so let's go to the next slide. So we've got the what, and we broke this presentation kind of down into groups, and we're now talking about the who. So you need to determine what criteria, you've figured out what work's going to be done, but if you're only going to have 25% of your people come in, that means you're going to have to figure out how you decide who those people are. Neutral standards, you can use seniority if that makes sense. Business requirements, back to what Bert was saying, do you want to have the nature of the work, the necessary skills? You may decide that you're going to keep certain people and we've talked about this on other ones, let people go. You need to document what your decision-making process is and make sure that it's not discriminatory. One of the things we've talked about before too, some people may not be available. They're either sick, they have someone in their house who's sick, they may have concerns, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. They may have concerns because of their own personal health. So you're going to have people that you're going to not be able to return for various reasons. So you need to figure out how you're going to accommodate that and who's going to be next on the list. And David, I cannot tell you, having been through RIFs over the years, if you don't document it now and who made the decisions and what the criteria are, you're never going to remember it when you have to defend it in court, 5 years from now.
Correct. Yeah.
Anything else, gentlemen, on those thoughts?
Oh, contemporaneous documentation, though, is very important, and I think that gets overlooked a lot. All right.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the when. Bert?
I'd be glad to. Some of the things we've already touched on, but the first thing to think about, this is when you're actually deciding who's going to come in. It's, can they get there? How will they get there? The kinds of decisions, these are the kinds of decisions that you hadn't thought of before. Are the elevators adequate? Are the lobbies adequate? Again, go back to the CDC guidance about the kinds of distancing you should try to work out with your landlord if it's not your building, so that people feel safe coming back to the office. Nita touched on this in the previous slide about figuring who's going to come to work when. Do you want partial shifts? Do you want part of the crew? Do you have enough work for the whole crew to come? If you don't, who gets chosen to come, which times to do what? Can you work in shifts? Does that make sense for your office? What kind of work does your office do that can meaningfully use part of your workforce at home, part of your workforce working remotely? In light of the CDC's comments about public transport, we still believe that for many people, public transport is going to be the dominant mode for people getting to work. But in many cities, Washington being one of them, the metro is on a skeleton crew. They are, every 20 minutes in the best of times, including rush hour. So it may no longer be as viable, and it may force you to start thinking of staggered start times. It may force you to start thinking of working in shifts. And then, of course, there is the ringer in all of this. Who among your workers or their families have been exposed? Who are ill? Who are vulnerable? Who think they've been exposed? And how does that work into how you're going to staff and how you're going to communicate to your other workforce the kinds of protections you are providing to make yours the place that people feel comfortable coming back to work. Again, a huge list of decisions of very important kinds.
One thing I would just note is most of these you need to continue to keep monitoring because so many of these things will change, including as we're seeing flare-ups of COVID infection in different communities, and you should be prepared to throttle back or readjust further as circumstances warrant. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit then briefly about how workers return, and I'll be happy to kick that off. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion. I think most people are familiar that the concept is people don't just sort of sashay in the door, that there needs to be a level of due diligence. That is recommended, again, by both the OSHA guidelines and the CDC guidelines to see whether people are asymptomatic but potentially carriers. Obviously, if they're symptomatic, also, we want to screen that out. So at this point, a number of practices have developed. Some employers have developed a self-certification, either by people doing it at home, people doing it on their phones, but they go through a questionnaire. It basically says, I've taken my temperature today, I'm less than 100.4. It says that I don't have any symptoms, no one in my house is demonstrating symptoms, I haven't traveled anywhere, all sorts of questions of that sort. I'm not sure self-certification is the best practice, but that is a practice that some are doing. But a number of workplaces, and I'm sure we've seen them, and including some retail stores are actually starting to do some of this, is some level of screening of people before they come into the workplace. Right. The most typical one is taking the temperature, as indicated the little picture there on the slide. Anyone that works in the White House, for example, is a workplace that many are familiar with. They all have their temperature taken every day before anyone comes into the White House. The staff, the reporters, anyone that works there has the temperature taken. They also do a basic questionnaire on how they're feeling, whether anyone in their home, and so forth. A lot of employers are doing that. There has been some challenge in terms of whether the equipment's available and how that information is gathered, but that issue, and we'll delve into that a little bit, but kind of how to deal with that. But that is another mechanism that as people are coming in, you gather information, either again from apps or otherwise from people as they come through. Keeping in mind that if they're waiting in line because of that, you have the whole social distancing. You got to keep people 6 feet apart. Got questions about whether it's compensable. There's a lot of issues that are sort of embedded into this. Next is a concept of tracing, tracking. If people become ill, at least understanding who they may have come in contact with in the workplace. Employers generally are not tracing who they dealt with outside of work, but we're talking in the workplace context.
Right.
Larger workplaces are starting to use a concept called gridding, where they put people into certain areas. So I work in the accounting department, hypothetically. I will be required to stay basically in the corner of the floor where the accounting department is. There'll be a washroom that I'm assigned to, and that way, if I or anyone in accounting becomes sick, we have a better control in an office setting for contact tracing and sanitizing and follow-up. And then all the protocols, if you have people in an office, are they going out to lunch? Are we going to check them back in each time? Where have they been? What are the protocols? Final point, and this has come up, some employers are saying, should we have releases signed? I'm not a fan of a release. I don't think Nita and Bert are fans of the release. No. For an employer to say to its employee, here, sign a release, and frankly, I'm not sure of the legal efficacy of doing that. So perhaps a different answer in terms of visitors, though I'm not sure that's what that says about your workplace. If you think you have to have someone sign a release to come in,
right.
I don't know what the message is to your workers, but releases are being developed by some. There are a lot of people that are fans of these, and they're a tool that are being explored. I would just put a lawyer flag down that if you are using a release, please check your state law, particularly because a lot of state laws this potentially violates state policy to that type of adhesion contract. So, but people are using releases. I don't think for workers, maybe for customers in stores or for you'll get your hair cut.
Vendors, yeah.
Vendors, something like that.
David, one other thing we heard about is some employers are using like Beulah the buzzer so that if you get too close to somebody in the workplace, it goes off. And I thought, oh boy, that's going to be really distracting. But trying to keep the 6 feet, which I thought was very interesting, that they would come up with that kind of I don't know whether it's an app or something that they put on their
It's actually just a
whatever.
physical device that you either put in your pocket or clip on your lapel. And when you come in, you put it on, and everyone has it on and has a little low-grade radio signal, and it just gives a little bing so everyone realizes, whoops, we got too close. And then they take it off. So it minimizes privacy issues, which is what some of the apps have. Bert, any comments on that?
I'd like to go back to self-certification for a minute, although I'm not a fan of the employee self-certification. The usefulness of the form is also to get the employee to tell you about other activities, other family members, possible exposures elsewhere. And it has its use just as a kind of constant upgrade because, as you pointed out earlier, this is a fluid system that has to be monitored.
Right.
Well, one thing I want to say on that, and then we move on here, but the concept of how much information you gather. There's very well-developed interest on privacy. The EEOC has said we can collect the basic temperature information we've talked about, but except for our most top-level CEOs, we have spent so much time sort of learning we only look at our employees and what they do in the workplace. Well, now all of a sudden we have a very legitimate reason to really talk to them about what are you doing outside the work? Were you at some place where you potentially were exposed? Were you, are members of your household? I mean, now we have sort of turned on its head for these purposes, but the concept that we are potentially not only is a good idea, we may be compelled to the extent we're going to follow the guidelines and best practices to affirmatively be asking questions about your conduct and circumstances outside of work. And that's because at this point, that's the only way we know of to help flag potentially asymptomatic carriers of the disease.
David, perfect example. We talked about Lake of the Ozarks over Memorial Day weekend where they had pictures. One of the people who was there, of course, tested positive. Here in St. Louis, employers asked their employees if they had been down there. That was one of the questions they asked. So, Alabama beaches. I was talking to somebody in Florida, no one's wearing masks. So anyway, I think that's a valid question.
Yeah. It's a new area. All right. Well, let's flip into some of the policies and the operational concerns and talk a little bit about some of these issues. Bert, do you want to kick off our first slide, please, on policies?
I think this is Nita's slide.
Actually, it's
Nita, I'm sorry. My error. Right.
Anyway, I think Bert talks on the next one. Anyway, this whole thing is, one of the things we've talked about is there are lots of things you need to review in your policies, and this is really in the lawyer and HR wheelhouse. One of the recommendations that we've seen and we agree with and recommend is perhaps you develop policies just for the pandemic. You don't try to change all of your individual policies. You simply write one big, it's part of your response plan, for example. And you look at what policies do you need to look at and how you need to have them couched in the COVID environment. Review your policies around sick leave and return to work. Your reasonable accommodation policies. You may want to add some additional language around your ability to provide temporary accommodations, in certain circumstances. We know EEOC is looking at harassment and non-discrimination, so you need to make sure you have a way to update your folks about that, and make sure your managers and your employees know that's not allowed. David and I talked on a earlier webinar we could talk for hours about the whole issues around wage and hour. With these people only coming in for certain periods of time, how much are they really going to be working? You've got a whole list of issues, time tracking, what's going to be compensable time, what happens with salary reductions. You need to look at your work at home policies. I mean, people have been working from home, but have you updated your policies in light of the pandemic? What about your benefits? And finally, discipline for those who refuse to wear masks, for example. I think we have a lot of people who think masks are not for them, they're illegal. Well, not in the workplace. I mean, every place, when you go into places, they can require you to wear masks, or you're not going to be allowed in, or you can be fired as an employee if you're not going to follow the rules. David and Bert, anything else?
One of the implications that I've seen is as you start working in the office, you'll determine more and more how many workers you need to do what and how long they're working.
Correct.
And for many employers, your benefits, particularly your health and other benefits, are queued to the number of hours you work. So if you dip below correct. 30 or 35, you're no longer eligible for the plan as written. So there are a panoply of issues of that kind that you have to pay attention to keep everybody either entitled to, or you understand that some may no longer be full-time workers.
Correct.
A couple of things. The developing the policy, as you point the very first bullet, that is something we've been doing. I think that really is a best practice, and to tweak right. and make sure that you're complying with and update as necessary your other existing policies. Number two, the wage hour point that you touched on, Nita, we're actually going to do a whole drill down on that next week to really flesh that out, because we're finding that is something that has a lot of nooks and crannies that people need to are forgetting about, frankly, or are just screwing up inadvertently by not thinking through. Number three, the concept of wearing the mask that you mentioned in disciplining. If you have a traditional office setting where people still have offices, they may not need to wear the mask when they're physically in their office. But when they come out of the office and they're in the hallway or going back and forth to the washroom, etc., then the masks need to be put on. So understanding the use of face coverings in addition to that gets to be a little more complicated. And of course, a lot of offices don't have the traditional individual offices, and we've talked about that before. A good resource on that, different states have issued some guidance on offices, particularly Connecticut has a very detailed guidance on office protocols. It's worth looking at, and Ohio also is pretty darn good. We've talked about those in the past, but if anyone needs that information, get in touch with us. We can point you to it. But those are good additional points, plus some of the checklists that we've developed. So good.
Right, exactly. I think Bert now has the next slide.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, folks. All right, we're on our, we're kind of moving through your work day. You've made all your plans. You figured out who you want to come back. You figured out how they're going to get there. You figured out that who's going to have transport, who's going to show up, and now they're in the office. And this is when you have to start making operational plans. And I apologize if some of this is repetitive, but now we're deciding in actual fact what you're going to require. Will you require masks? As David said, in the office, probably not. The minute you leave your office, certainly. Many people do not have offices. CDC is very strong on wearing masks. They think it's one of the most effective, easiest things to do. Will you require it?
Right.
Washing and hand sanitizing. What will you make available? How will you incentivize it? How will you monitor it? Social distancing in an office is one of the hardest things that you're going to have to deal with. Even if you go to a staggered work starting time, or a work shift notion, or a tactical team notion, so that you actually have the right people working together, how can you create a context in which they can work safely? And it's not every office permits the space for a number, 10 people, to work 6 feet apart. It is a challenge intellectually, and then it's a challenge operationally. You know, can you use the e-monitors that Nita talked about? And then what procedures, matters you've never thought of in a serious way before. What procedures will you use for maintaining the kind of health and safety requirements that your workers and you require to keep that office a safe and healthy place for your workers and your business invitees, your clients to come to? And you have to work probably with the building management on this. And if not, you can install your own procedures about cleaning
Right.
the office, the bathrooms, all the high-touch areas. You know, what kind of signage would you develop to remind people about gridding, and remind people that Group A uses this bathroom, Group B uses that one? How are you, you know, those of you that got rid of dress codes because you thought they were unenforceable, well, you're back in the kind of enforcement business on where people sit, where people walk. How do you monitor it? How do you make it a part of everyday life in terms of how your office works? And the last one is this laundry list of all the kinds of things you have to think about in terms of cleaning and maintaining. The use of the elevators, the stairs, restrooms. Will there be common rooms? Will you close your common rooms? Will you have selective use of the conference rooms? If there's a coffee station, can it be a common one? Will there be staggered times for use? Will there be a special cleaning schedule? Can you continue to have a fridge for the common use so that there's a possibility of cross-contamination in foods? These are the kinds of things for which you should look to the CDC for guidance, because clearly they're areas beyond most people's expertise, but they now become part of our responsibilities for creating and maintaining the kind of workplace where you and your workers feel safe coming to work. It's a big deal, a hard deal.
Indeed. All right. Well, let's talk about some of the other issues. Let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about some of these issues upon reopening. So all that Bert has described, and Nita, we've gotten sorted out. Now, we mentioned before about this, you know, initial collection of information. This is something that, again, is not something that's being done on the fly. If you're going to collect, first of all, we've indicated the EEOC has said, yes, we may collect this. We do not violate the ADA. We've got to determine where we're going to put the information. You're allowed to keep it in not the personnel file, but you can keep it in the medical file. Are you going to record the actual temperature, or are you going to simply record, you know, above or below 100.4? In other words, green or red. Increasingly, a lot of people are saying, I just want green or red. I don't really want to get into what people's individual temperatures are. If they're over temperature the first time, are you going to give them best out of 3? Or are you going to take two readings because this equipment does malfunction some? Are you going to have a third party run the temperature for you? What protective gear is required? I mean, all of these are issues beyond the equipment, but the mechanics, how you gather the information, what you do with it. As a matter of OSHA, if you're down to following the OSHA protocols, there is a requirement that you maintain a workplace record for 30 years, 30 years. So if you're going to start collecting it, do you have an OSHA obligation on this information? That needs to be figured out. Contact tracing, we've referenced that before, how that will occur. Obviously, if you use the gridding or a concept of restricting people, which may be a quite different operational approach than people had before, that makes contact tracing much easier and more efficient, but it still is potentially difficult to do. There are state law privacy requirements. Nita lives right outside Illinois there in St. Louis.
I do.
Illinois has got a very
and they have very serious. They do, and they just passed that law, so you got to stay on top of those state laws.
And there are new laws coming on, and then of course, and that's just for your own employees, and then of course we have the business invitees, whether they be your clients, your customers, your vendors, all of this. This is the one. This is a lot of people have sort of focused on this, and the CDC, to Bert's point earlier, there's not a shall, but there are best practices. The best practices are at a minimum temperature check and some basic information gathering. Are they on their general health and the general health of their circumstances, I'll say, outside of work, whether they've been exposed. But how you go about that, this is very frustrating to people, because I think most employers at this point are like, for gosh sakes, just give me a list. I'll run the list, or I won't open it.
Exactly.
But that is not where it is at this point. So there's a lot of these decisions to be made on what is practical. All right.
David, just to give you an example, I'll just give you a quick example. So when we reopened hair salons and nails here, the individuals in the hair salon all wear they wear the regular mask, and they have a plastic screen. They're temperature checked every day to the extent that they can. They can't, do 6 feet all the time, but everyone has masks on. You can't go in until you're temperature checked as the client, and you have to clean your hands and wear a mask. So that's the kind of thing that's being done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tough environment.
It really is. Did we want to talk about what happens if your employees don't want to come back, David, in the next slide?
Yeah. Employees are like, wow, if you're asking all these questions, well, maybe I don't want to come back. Maybe it's more dangerous being at work than it is at home.
Correct.
And honestly, it potentially is more dangerous because you're exposed.
It is.
So Nita, why don't you take the lead on this one?
One thing I want to just make the point is, for employees, the more they are around COVID, the more likely they're going to get it. The more they're around people who might be sick, the more likely they're going to get it. So, while the customers coming and going are less likely to get it in that environment, the employees are. So we know there are going to be employees who are reluctant to return. Don't forget your ADA obligations. You certainly have individuals with disabilities that will ask to be accommodated. You're going to have a hard time saying they can't stay home. But I think childcare, David, honestly, is going to be the biggest problem. If the camps aren't open, a lot of childcare isn't open, what are you going to do in a situation where the employees literally have no one to watch their children? We know that we've talked in previous sessions about the emergency FMLA, and up to a point that works, but employers need to decide how they're going to handle it when the employees run out of the paid sick leave and no longer have the FMLA to cover them. Certainly, EEOC is strongly recommending that employers look at voluntary opportunities for accommodations for people. I think you can say, on a temporary basis, we're willing to do X, and just make it clear that this is not something you're going to do all the time. It's pandemic related. And also, you want to, as a business, you don't want to get the reputation of taking a hard line if you don't have to. But I did have one question for you, David and Bert, quickly. What happens if you have employees who are losing their minds at home and want to come to work, but you're concerned that they are susceptible to, they're the most susceptible people, and you prefer them to continue to work from home? Have recommendations for employers on that subject? Starting with David?
This is where we've had some clients, and they're very well intended. They're like, gosh, I don't want John or Susan to come back because I know she has asthma and is in a high risk category, and therefore, even though they may not be disabled vis-a-vis the ADA, I just don't want them to come back. So I'm looking out for their best interests. Even though their entire team is coming back in that 25%, I don't want them because I'm looking out for their best interests. Well, the EEOC has reminded us that we cannot do that. That is a per se violation because we're taking an action based on a disability or perceived disability. What we can do, though, and I think this is about as far as we can go, I think the employer can say, look, you're part of the team coming back. I understand you have asthma, and if you want, we can accommodate that if you want. But so in other words, you offer the ability to accommodate, but you don't direct or preclude the individual from coming back. That you cannot do, is my view. Bert?
Yeah, that's that's where the self-certification questionnaire can help you at least identify these people somewhat in advance. And I guess the other rationale is to go back to the CDC's hope is that employee compliance is the key to making the whole thing work, and to make the employee aware of his or her responsibility to not only himself but to her coworkers and to the entire office. It is one of the many challenges for which there's no easy answer.
Let me say one other thing on this reluctant employee. It is possible, and we have some clients that have this, that they have enough reluctant employees they cannot get a critical mass.
Correct.
So at that point, then the employer is going to say, look, the job requirement is you come here, we need 25%. I can only accommodate 2 people, so those slots are gone. The rest of you have to come. That would reach a point where if individuals refused who've been ordered and you were not able to accommodate them, then you would be facing a situation where they effectively would be quitting or their employment relationship could terminate, which also could limit and negatively impact their ability to qualify for unemployment. So
exactly. So gentlemen, we have about a limit to what we can do. We have about, speaking of a limit, we have about 4 minutes to go. So let's scoot through these last couple of slides. Bert, on complaints.
What we've been talking about leads exactly into this. What do you do when employees, reluctant or otherwise, complain about all of your efforts notwithstanding? What do you do? The main sources of complaints will be through OSHA. You can file a complaint with the OSHA or a state agency. You can file an EEOC or state agency complaint about if you're one of those vulnerable people who weren't called back and you believe it was a violation of either the ADA or Title VII. Social media, I don't know what you do about it. Everybody knows that Twitter and Yelp and things of that ilk have their own audience. And then, of course, there are the possibility of work stoppages. And you've seen some of those, oddly enough, at non-union facilities where there is no collective bargaining agreement, where people do not have no strike clauses. We're all familiar with the Google and I think Amazon work stoppages. A couple are happening at WeWork. The only thing you can do with respect to the formal complaints is, well, you know how to deal with those. You should have a communication plan in place to respond to complaints, especially social media complaints, and you should certainly have a response team available to deal with both the social media element, the general media element, the work reputational, the business reputational element of any kind of work stoppage. If it's come to the point of a work stoppage, that is a gigantic stop sign that something is happening in your office that you have not addressed in a meaningful way. There have not been many of them. Many people are very anxious to get back to work, but it's an eventuality you must address, and that's 2 minutes. How's that?
All right. Well, let's go.
And
let me
David?
quickly touch on next if you have a resurgence on the next slide. If we have an employee that's positive and comes back and we have a hot spot in the workplace, before you bring anyone back, you need to anticipate and have this plan in place, because time is of the essence in acting on it. If someone is positive, either symptoms work and you learn about it, you need to obviously tell them to stay home and take appropriate medical care. You need to communicate employees that may have been exposed. That's why, going back to that gridding concept, if we followed that, everyone within the grid that had contact with, we would make sure that the medical information that we're talking about is handled in an appropriately confidential manner. And the operations may be impacted. Those that have been potentially exposed may now be back to working at home. That whole operation, the office may need to be deep cleaned, and we have to then think forward again about, okay, once we get through that whole phase, how are we going to reopen? And you sort of press repeat and go through everything again. But how to close, you have to know when you open, because the way this disease is hopscotching around, it's like little brush fires, it's likely to occur. All right, a couple takeaways, Nita?
Yeah, let's just go to the last slide, Valerie, and quickly basically, you need to reimagine the open office, and we've talked about that extensively. Bert?
Well, as I say, developing your opening plan, look at the guidances we have and try to apply them in a practical way to the situation in your office.
Communication plan with everyone, all your supervisors, your managers, as well as your rank and file. Essential. People need to know what's expected of them before they come in.
Make sure you have monitors. David?
Yeah, and finally, the training. The training both on health and safety and on harassment. Both of those require stepped up new training to respond to this situation. Bert, last one.
Well, we will try to help you stay on top of the latest developments, but it is a shared responsibility. One of the ways we hope you can stay on top of developments is to join us during these webinars. We are right at our time. We want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And Valerie, take us away.
Yes, we would like to thank you for joining us. As a reminder, you may view the previous weekly briefings on our website at www.FortneyScott.com. And all registrants from today have been registered for future weekly briefings. Be on the lookout for additional updates, which will be sent via email. Later today, you will receive a survey requesting feedback for today's presentation. You are able to submit suggestions for future topics through the survey. Our next briefing will be on June 8th. Thank you in advance for completing the survey, and of course, if you have any questions, you may submit them via email to info@FortneyScott.com.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you all.
Stay safe.